Are sanctions an effective punishment for human rights abuses? The British government targets suspects linked to the killing of a Russian lawyer and a Saudi journalist. But will sanctions change anything? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. It's a crackdown on despots and dictators. Britain's government has announced its first sanctions since leaving the European Union and punishment for the perpetrators of what it calls gravest human rights offenders. The targets include suspects linked to the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi and Russians connected to the killing of tax fraud whistleblower lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. Sonia Gallego reports from London.
A long-awaited action against abusers of human rights. The measures announced by the Foreign Secretary committed the UK to holding perpetrators of mistreatment to account.
Today, this government and this House sends a very clear message on behalf of the British people that those with blood on their hands, the thugs of despots, the henchmen of dictators, will not be free to waltz into this country, to buy up property on the King's Road, to do their Christmas shopping in Knightsbridge, or frankly to siphon dirty money through British banks or other financial institutions.
The new regime of sanctions targets 49 individuals and organisations from Russia, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar and North Korea, designed to encourage better behaviour. The sanctions target those at the heart of Russia's interior ministry, such as Oleg Sirchenko, accused of being responsible for the death of Sergei Magnitsky, the Russian lawyer arrested after alleging that Russian officials were involved in large-scale tax fraud and who died in prison. Also sanctioned are those who were involved in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, including Saud Abdallah al-Qahtani, a senior advisor to the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and the senior official who planned and directed the murder of the Saudi journalist using a 15-man team. Also listed the perpetrators of ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya in Myanmar, Min Aung Hlaing and So Win, Commander-in-Chief and his deputy of the Myanmar Armed Forces, who unleashed a humanitarian disaster that killed thousands and left many more displaced. And the two organisations responsible for forced labour, torture and murder in North Korea's gulags. The sanctions also signify a change in the UK's status. No longer obliged to European Union rules, it is designed to place human rights front and centre of a new British policy.
I think timing was very key in this, where the end of the opportunity to delay the departure from the EU took place this weekend. And so this is a strong move to show that the UK is going to stand on its own and it's going to exercise this right.
The act is set to be extended and may challenge other countries such as China over their Uyghur detention camps and crackdowns on Hong Kong protesters. The question is, will they go far enough to affect a change in behaviour? Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera.
We've been speaking to Sergei Magnitsky's former employer and businessman Bill Browder. He campaigned for the British sanctions as well as the Magnitsky Act in the US, and he hopes the rest of the world will follow suit in punishing human rights abusers.
I've been campaigning and advocating for consequences for the murder of Sergei Magnitsky for a decade. And it used to be in the old times that governments would just issue stern words saying, we condemn the such and such government for doing some atrocity. And the people who were doing the atrocity were just laughing because there was no consequence to them. But by individualizing it surgically, pointing out with evidence the person who's committed the human rights abuse, and then punishing that person with something they care about, which is the ability to travel and the ability to spend their money in the West, all of a sudden everyone's paying attention. And I can tell you from my own experience with Vladimir Putin that he made repealing the Magnitsky Act his single largest foreign policy priority because he was so upset by it. So I think that this is a very powerful tool. It's something that upsets both the people who are sanctioned, and it scares the hell out of the people who haven't been sanctioned, who are scared or worried that they'll be next. This creates a whole different playing field for the people who are being asked by their bosses in certain countries to do terrible things. In the past, they could do something terrible and know they'd be fully protected by their own government. Now, all of a sudden, there's no way that their governments can protect them against this, and they have a different calculus that they don't know. Perhaps they think that their dictator won't be in power in 10 years' time, but they'll be on the sanctions list for the rest of their life. And that's a different scenario than if they're fully protected. And I think that will change behavior.
Let's bring in our guest from London, David Haigh, human rights lawyer and founder of the campaign group Detained International. From Moscow, Anastasia Gafarova, political writer and deputy director for the Centre of Political Information. And from Turkey's capital, Ankara, Yasin Aktay, chief advisor to the chairman of the AK Party, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and a prime witness in the Khashoggi murder trial underway in Istanbul. A warm welcome to you all. I want to start in London with David Haigh. A lot of what Dominic Raab has said is quite good fodder for late-night comedy TV shows. They're not allowed to come to London and buy a property in the King's Road, and they're not allowed to, do things like that. However, there is a serious question behind all of this. To work, these sanctions do need teeth. They do need bite. Have they gone far enough?
Well, I think, firstly, it's a very welcome step, what Dominic Raab announced on Monday in the sanctions for the worst human rights abusers. But quite rightly, like you said, unless they actually have teeth and that they are consistently applied to all human rights abusers, whether or not the UK has a good relationship with that country or the specific leader, then they really aren't going to be worth the paper that they're written on. And one of those elements that we need to look at when we look at Saudi, we see that they've already mentioned 20 of those involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but they have conveniently avoided the person widely believed to have been the person that essentially ordered that, the Crown Prince. And if we're going to be looking at that kind of inconsistent application of the rules to people that they like or that they don't, then they really will lose their teeth.
Let's bring in Moscow here and Anastasia Gafarova. A lot of these have been aimed at people that the Russians insist is a domestic internal affair and has nothing to do with the international community. What's Moscow's view of this current move by Britain?
Oh, welcome. Moscow's view is quite clear that this new portion of sanctions has political implication, and each new portion, especially if it does not affect industries, financial sector, the country as a whole, are perceived quite calmly. And these sanctions were quite expected. The only thing that was a mystery was the list of the designated persons. But in general, as expected, it patterned the American version of the list and of the act. And so it is quite clear that on the part of the Great Britain, it is an attempt to reinstate itself as a global stakeholder in international affairs, now independent from the European Union. And it's also an attempt to unite with the United States in terms of foreign policy. So it is perceived very calmly. It does not affect Putin's friends, and as some media want to present, because not Alexei Bastrykin or any other persons from the general prosecutors or even doctors in the list are in Mr. Putin's inner circle. So it is quite peacefully perceived, but I would draw your attention to the fact that these new sanctions coincided with quite important events in Russia itself that affect domestic policy. I mean, just a few days ago, Russia's president signed into law the constitutional amendments that were approved by Russian population a few days prior to that. So these sanctions have a domestic dimension for Russia. And in fact, each time Great Britain, United States, its allies, some other foreign countries introduce the measures that are perceived here senseless and aggressive at some point, it brings unity to Russian people, and it brings more popularity to the authorities. So Great Britain and and its allies have think more what they want to achieve in the end of the day.
Well, let's bring in David Haigh here in London. David, you've heard our guest in Moscow say that effectively Britain is flexing muscles it simply doesn't have. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think Britain's role in the world going forward after leaving the European Union is one that we're still building effectively, and so to a certain extent, I would. But something that Dominic Raab did point out quite well is that a lot of the world does come here, particularly from the Gulf countries. If we look at the UAE, for instance, the UAE royal family come here all the time, and we've also found, as the UN found, I think in 2016, that the UAE uses systematic torture and abuses of human rights. So, provided that these sanctions have teeth and go wider than they are currently, then I do think that, bearing in mind that England is a place where a lot of these human rights abuses do come for summer, do come for holidays, do travel through, it very much is a hub of the international world. So whether or not it's in England flexing its muscle, the very fact that they come here, they travel here, does mean that we can actually basically enforce sanctions against human rights abusers once they're in the jurisdiction. But again, the question is, are we going to do it consistently? For example, again, referring to the UAE, why are there no members of the UAE government on that list when the UAE has been found by the likes of the UN and even by the English High Court, the ruler of Dubai, to have abused people's human rights? Why are they not on that list?
Let's bring in Yasin Akhter here from Ankara. Yasin, the court case is going on at the moment within Istanbul to try and bring justice to Jamal Khashoggi's family. However, will these sanctions that have been announced by Dominic Raab and Great Britain have any impact whatsoever when it comes to the nitty-gritty of that court case?
Of course, these sanctions are important or the declaration of these sanctions, at least as an expression of some sensitivity about human rights and the violation of these human rights and these persons, especially the tried persons in their absence in Istanbul, or are all in Saudi Arabia, and they haven't been tried in their country in any transparent or any just way. And Jamal Khashoggi's incident was very important from universal point of view indeed, but nothing any step has been taken from the international world or international justice, and it requires probably the intervention of international justice, because as you know, Turkey, yes, it took place in Turkish country, but all the involved persons are absent from Istanbul, and the Istanbul court couldn't their statement about this. And I think that there should be a sensitivity, a universal sensitivity, international sensitivity about such violations of human rights. Of course, I don't care about Britain's, UK's international interest in this or any other way, but of course, and this is also welcome. I think this step is welcome, but of course we want and we expect it to be applied to many other issues. Like, for example, in Egypt, there was there were many violations on human rights, that massacres took place in Rabia Square, and about 3,000 people were killed by the dictator, by the coup d'etat attempter, or the coup d'etat dictator Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who committed this crime, and nobody had reflected in any way, and it become the international human rights activists or the human rights sensitivity became very silent about this, for example.
But so Yasin, you do say that this is welcome.
When it took place, of course, to be extended also if in more wide area.
You say that this move is welcome. However, there are many calls from international human rights groups about Turkey's own record when it comes to human rights, particularly when it comes to the arrests of journalists and academics. There is a potential that this law could be used against senior members of your own party.
Yes, if there is something about Turkey, about any violation of human rights, all human rights activists are welcome in Turkey. They can come and they come question, they come ask our questions, but not everything, every claim is true, of course. We are replying to this. If anything, any violations of human rights happen in Turkey, we as human rights activists also very ready to interfere to such violations also. And those journalists, those so-called journalists, which are making propaganda against Turkey, are making all this propaganda in a very transparent media in Turkey. And there is a opposition in Turkey. Opposition, very free opposition, can do anything, can say anything, can make broadcasting anyway. There are many opposition TVs in Turkey. They can do their all claims, and it is not it cannot be compared with such things, of course. And no, there is courts in Turkey, very transparent courts, accountable courts and media and any system in Turkey. Those who are making propaganda against Turkey, of course, are the people who committed the coup d'etat in Turkey, who attempted the coup d'etat. And thanks for God that unfortunately it failed. If it not
well, let's
failed,
bring in Anastasia Gafarova in Moscow to answer a couple of your points. To answer a couple of your points that you did make, Yassine. Firstly, what can Moscow do to counter this?
Well, Russian authorities have already stated that this gesture will not be unanswered. So there'll be probably some symmetric measure. But the other thing that is more important is that, as you have mentioned and you're very right, that these sanctions for human rights abuses, they are of selective nature. And the best thing that Russia can do, and the topic that Russia brings back more and more, is that the language of sanctions should not be used for investigating, for overcoming the human rights abuses. And the fact that Great Britain introduced these sanctions not only against Russia but also against some other countries, and the selection of these countries appears quite strange, means that and gives an opportunity for Russia to state once again that the sanctions war should not be unwinded and widen up. And all the human rights abuses should be investigated according to appropriate procedures, while countries should gather at the negotiations table. So the main objective for Russia is to stop the sanctions war and to show that it is not the peaceful way for the 21st century to solve the issues.
Well, let's bring in David Haigh here from London. David, Saudi Arabia's investments in the UK, absolutely huge. They're about to buy Newcastle Football Club, or trying to at least. Is this a way, as many people have said, to actually give the Saudis a bit of a slap on the wrist, but it's business as usual?
Well, I think only time will tell. I mean, it's as I said, it's a welcome move, but it's not a good start that there are people not on the list that should be there. We should have seen the Crown Prince and others from Saudi in relation to the Khashoggi killing. We should see UAE leaders in relation to all sorts of abuses of human rights on that list, and they're not there. And it was only, I think, about a month ago that Dominic Raab referred to the UAE as friends of the UK. So that's a concern. And when you look at the Newcastle Football Club potential sale to Saudi Arabia, time will tell. If that is allowed to go through, then that will show you that these sanctions really are worthless, because that should not be permitted to go through in the normal course with the rules of the English Premier League. But now with these new sanctions, how could that possibly occur?
But it has to be, David, business as usual. Where Britain has left the EU, it's looking for business partners. It needs laws like this to give it the appearance of, wanting and trying to do something about human rights abuses. However, Britain does need business partners, and there's a real politic there.
Well, exactly, and that's the worry. I mean, we often see, again, focusing on the UAE, we often see, as I said, Dominic Raab referring to the UAE as friends, at the same time as there was a High Court ruling in the UK that the ruler of Dubai had essentially abused his children's and his wife's human rights in the UK. So it's very concerning that the government can look the other way when there are commercial interests that will ensure that these sanctions don't apply to people that could, do good things for England on a commercial perspective. It should be universally applied, whether the country is a friend, where you have commercial interests or not. If someone has abused human rights, then these sanctions should be applied against them in England, full stop. And if that isn't going to be the situation, which concerningly the start so far seems that it may not be, then they really aren't worth the paper they're written on.
Yasin Aktay in Ankara, what do you think of Britain's role in the world currently? Do you think it is a power that can help, or do you think this is simply them leaving the EU and needing partners across the world? What's the Turkish view on that?
Of course, every country has its own role, but I am not interested in its role or in its seeking for its new role in the new world, because it did its Brexit. And after the Brexit, it has to set its own rules and its own regulations and its own principles, which is, of course, as was mentioned before, UK is a very historical imperial country, and it is in seek for representing the world's values or the universal values, etc. Not important. I think every country has its own right to seek for being more powerful, of course. But the important thing is to set for really and to agree internationally by all the nations. And Turkey also has this claim, of course, to represent and to seek for the asylums, to the rights of the people who are being wronged, and who are to the immigrant people, to the migration, to the now people. Turkey is hosting about 4 or 5 million people from some crisis regions, like, for example, from Syria, from Yemen, from Egypt, from Libya, from Iraq, and from Myanmar, or Rohingya, or from Afghanistan. Many people are seeking for refugee in Turkey in order to shelter in Turkey, and that is, of course, let's compete in the goodness, not in the badness. Because if
I do apologise, Yasin. I do apologise. We are running out of time, and I want to come to our other guest, Anastasia in Moscow. You've been not dismissive of this, but you've said that this is Britain trying to flex its muscles, and therefore Russia is taking it that way. But what happens if other countries sign up to the Magnitsky Act? If they try and do their own versions of that, surely then that becomes a worry for Russia.
In fact, there were attempts by the European Union to introduce its version of the Magnitsky Act, so it will be expected again, because now we are living in a sanctions war. We see that the United States introduce more and more sanctions against China, so I'm pretty sure that it will be perceived calmly, but it will force Russia to work out some symmetric measures, which is not in Russia's interest, in fact, because, currently facing this corona crisis and so on, it is better for countries to unite other than to find ways to introduce new and new restrictions, especially given the fact that the arrest of Mr. Magnitsky was not disputed even by the European Court for Human Rights. Yes, there were maybe abuses and mistreatment towards him, but it should be proven. But the fact of his arrest was not disputed. So it is a very complicated question, and it needs better procedural investigation concerning various countries.
I want to give thanks, actually, to all our guests, David Haigh, Anastasia Gafarova and Yasin Aktay. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.